Mark Farmer is the founder and CEO of real estate and construction consultancy CAST, and was author of the government-sponsored report Modernise or Die, which set out to solve fundamental problems facing the construction industry. And one of his key recommendations was that the industry should invest more in modern methods of construction to increase the speed and quality of delivery. And he recently published a report on MMC written with Mike Death of HTA, suggesting that the government should set out a target of 75,000 homes per year by MMC by 2030. So, Mark, I mean, following previous reports on construction over the last 30 years, Latham, Egan, Barker, Calcutt, Lyons, et al., Modernise or Die does seem to have had the greatest impact on industry and government. So are you pleased with the outcomes to date?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes, Peter. I think the timing has helped a lot, if I'm perfectly honest. So when I published in 2016, there was the emergence of various structural issues in the industry that perhaps hadn't been so apparent when those previous reports you referenced were published, and I've probably benefited from that in some way in terms of the deep-seated issues, particularly around the resiliency of the industry, the skills decline that we've got, the aging workforce, the quality issues, the financial fragility. We've seen just so much of it play out over the last 4 years has helped, I think, reinforce some of the messaging in my report. So, yeah, I'm obviously pleased that it's had an impact of some kind. Clearly there's lots more to do, and our industry is constantly looking to evolve and change, and my report is just part of that overall story, I think. But yeah, I'm very happy with the progress that's been made, the fact that government has reacted to it and adopted various recommendations that were embedded in it, and to an extent industry is starting to do much of what I talked about when it was all for 4 years ago.
So in your report with HTA called Build Homes, Build Jobs, Build Innovation, why did you decide to focus on volumetric systems as against other forms of assembly?
Yeah, so it was quite deliberate actually, and it wasn't meant to be restrictive in terms of promoting the appropriate use of modern methods of construction, and many will know that MMC has been formally categorized now. There's 7 categories of MMC, ranging from volumetric, which is category 1, through to panelized systems, component systems, and even methods that aren't related to off-site construction, like digital on-site construction. But the reason for focusing on modular, full volumetric modular, was deliberate in the sense that I think MMC can do 2 things to particularly the home building market. One is clearly to improve productivity. One of the big issues we have that going back to Modernise or Die, I spoke about, was the inherent inability of the industry to improve its productivity, and combined with its site labor intensity, it sets itself up for so many problems, particularly in the climate we're in at the moment around declining skills. But the second issue is about diversification, and actually mixing up the market and introducing new disruptors, new innovators, new players on the pitch, as it were, that helps the market to thrive and to actually evolve over time. And what I'm seeing and I have seen over the last few years is that additionality and diversification, if you like, in the market is coming more from the players that actually are bringing turnkey solutions forward. And most of those at the moment tend to be volumetric modular systems, where you have manufacturers that are also developers that are offering an entire solution and handing the keys over at the end of it. And they in turn are then disrupting the current status quo in terms of house builders and the like, who are still pursuing traditional techniques. So that was one of the sort of key planks behind that philosophy. It doesn't mean that model will be the only way that turnkey solutions come forward in the future. And there's already examples where we're seeing developers using manufacturing techniques that are not volumetric. So for instance, Buccleuch, the JV between IKEA and Skanska, is not wholly wedded to volumetric, but they're offering a development solution. And for me, it's that diversification, additionality in the market that is really important in all of this. And sometimes that's difficult to do when you're talking to manufacturers of bits of buildings or kits of parts that actually involve other people in the solution.
Now, I thought it's very interesting to note that Nick Boyd-Smith wrote the introduction to your report and connected MMC to new government planning policies relating to the whole idea of repetition in Georgian architecture and other aspects of that. So apart from external finishes, the idea of linking construction to planning in this way is pretty unique, isn't it?
It is, but I thought it was opportune to make that connection, and asking Nicholas to write the foreword was very deliberate in that regard. Obviously, the timing with the white paper planning for the future was right in terms of just reinforcing this potential enabler, and it's all about enablement in my view, of how you take a design code, pattern book type philosophy and actually exploit that to its full. And one of the areas of exploitation is the idea of digital design, linking to digital planning, linking ultimately through to digital manufacturing. And there's some very early stage examples of where that can look, where has been trialed and actually looks really interesting. So the idea of using site-based design codes, using configurated tools where prospective purchasers might be able to modify their homes within the constraints of a design code that then can link to sending an order to a factory, which is effectively a sort of a custom build approach at scale, I think is really, really interesting. And that, so from my perspective, those planning changes, particularly when it comes to the design coding and pattern book thinking, open up opportunities in terms of how we deliver homes from a manufacturing basis rather than just a traditional build basis. There's one other thing I would point out, though, that's probably a more tangible link to the world of MMC and planning, and that is the benefit of when MMC, particularly when it's done well, can actually reduce the impact on local communities. So the whole idea of having, big disruption while you're building a development out, and you have loads of traffic, you have disruption from noise and all sorts of related issues, can be minimized through the use of high speed modern methods of construction that enable those environmental impacts and those community impacts to be minimized. So that's a much more tangible reflection perhaps on one of the benefits of linking the idea of MMC and planning.
And can you get blanket building regulation approval for a product?
So at the moment, the whole evolution of building regulations is still not, it's not fully thought through, in my opinion. I think there's lots of potential to have type approval thinking, and some of the warranty providers who also act as approved inspectors are thinking like that, in terms of going into factories more and more and being able to actually sign off on manufacturing systems. They still have to be approved on a site level basis, because every site has its own constraints, has its own foundations, has its own drainage connections. But what goes on in the factory, there's much more potential to have a type approval, pre-approved type approach to building control. But my personal thoughts are that actually government can play a bigger role in enabling that move towards that pre-approval. It happens in other countries. So New Zealand, for instance, is moving in that direction at the moment. Hong Kong, Singapore both have systems that enable pre-approval. So clearly we have an opportunity with the right checks and balances, because it's about high technical standards being rolled out, to accelerate that process.
Now, there's been a lot of talk in London, around London councils, about collaboration between local authorities to create scale and more stable demand. Is that actually taking place?
I wouldn't say it's actually taking place as we speak. I think there's lots of talk about it, and that is important. I think everything starts with the discussion, and those discussions are actively taking place. And indeed, I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with Tom Copley, about this whole concept of how we get the maybe GLA to act as a convener in greater collaboration between the London boroughs. It is a critical unlock, in my opinion. It's one of the things that was written in the recent report I co-authored with Mike Diaf that you referred to. The idea of aggregation and collaboration is a big stepping stone to how we free up and the MMC market at scale. So at the moment, it's a market failure point. The fact that there's too many manufacturers chasing too much fragmented demand, and vice versa, is a big issue. So the idea of London coming together at scale, cross borders in terms of local authority boundaries, pooling their demand, having more joined up conversations with manufacturers, thinking about areas of standardization, even not to suggest cookie cutter architecture or anything like that, but there's certain principles of design that can lead to a much more joined up conversation with the manufacturers, and actually in turn improve the commercial aspects, because ultimately it's about economies of scale. The more you can deliver of a consistent throughput in the manufacturing sector, then the cheaper it should get, and that benefit should play back to those that are commissioning that work. So I'm really hopeful, actually, Peter, that we're starting to see the beginnings of those conversations. There's a few pioneers out there who are really leading from the front, the likes of Barking and Dagenham, for instance, are doing some really interesting stuff when it comes to MMC and looking at their program and their pipeline. Greenwich as well have taken a stand here. So I think we're going to see more and more of that, and hopefully a lot more joining up.
Very good. Now, when the Japanese company Sekisui started discussions with Urban Splash about their modern methods of construction, the Japanese were astonished at just the lack of investment in R&D in the UK construction industry generally compared to what they have in Japan. Do you think this is beginning to change as a result of as a result of your report?
I think it's work in progress. I think there's definitely, I think the whole move to MMC and manufacturing thinking is forcing this. So I think there's a recognition that you can't just set up in this sector without having done the hard yards up front, and that ultimately involves R&D. It involves prototyping. It involves doing things, making mistakes, actually, if we're really honest about this, and learning from them and iterating and improving. So that concept of R&D, which has been so apparent in other sectors like automotive and aerospace, and is what the Japanese have just accepted as being the norm because of how they've actually built homes for the last 40, 50 years, is, I think, slowly going to take shape in the UK. We're going to see more examples of manufacturing systems that have done those hard yards, as I say, to actually prove the concept, to prototype in the real world. Unlike cars and airplanes, a lot of our prototyping is on live projects, which is, it's a risk, but it's also an opportunity to think differently about how we prove performance, how we do post-occupancy in a much more different way, how we take data and evidence and we feed that back into a process that makes the production better and better. And I think we're starting to see that, and certainly Urban Splash in their JV with Sekisui are taking that very seriously, I know, and you'll see more and more of their peer group doing the same. And I'm hoping the end beneficiary of that will be the consumer, like those that are renting and owning some of these new wave of homes that are going to be brought forward on the back of that.
Very good. Well, Mark Farmer, thank you very much for your insights, and a lot of things, aspects of the building industry are being accelerated, I think, by COVID-19, and I'm sure the uptake of MMC is one of those as well, as we will see also once we decide how we're going to come out of the EU. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.